Welcome to this week's program of the Wildwood Park Summer Nature Series. This is Susie Leslie, and I'll be sharing some ideas on how most anyone can bring nature closer to home. I've been creating native plant habitats and giving programs on landscaping for wildlife since my days as a graduate student in wildlife science at Virginia Tech. But now I'm gardening in very limited space and suddenly spending much more time at home, as I'm sure you all are. Spending time in natural areas can be vital for our mental and physical health, but this year, many of our natural areas are out of reach, they're closed, or they're crowded just when we really need them the most. Our most accessible natural areas are those right outside our own doors. So this may be the perfect time to turn your outdoor space into the best possible habitat for wildlife and for everyone in your home. Perhaps the best place to start is with Doug Tallamy's first two books. Tallamy is professor of entomology at University of Delaware and came out with his first book, Bringing Nature Home: How You Can Sustain Wildlife with Native Plants, in 2007. Then in 2014, he collaborated with Rick Dark on The Living Landscape, Designing for Beauty and Biodiversity in the Home Garden. Remember when summer meant scrubbing windshields and car grills could yield a science fair project worth of insects? Hopefully you've been aware, we're all aware, and we need to know we're losing biodiversity at an alarming rate. Tallamy's books really can inspire you to garden as if life depended on it. Join the grassroots effort to save as much biodiversity as possible by beginning with your own backyard. Before we get into specific garden ideas, we need to understand the why behind our plant choices. So let's start with the birds. Almost all terrestrial birds depend on insects throughout spring and summer, both for themselves and to raise their young. Caterpillars are the primary food for nestlings of many of the bird species. About how many caterpillars do you think it takes for one pair of birds to raise just one nest of young? One pair of chickadees. Now think about how small chickadees. One pair of chickadees needs more than 5,000 caterpillars to raise one brood. Some songbirds may have 3 broods in one summer, 3 nestings full of young. So we need lots of insects, especially caterpillars, in our yards during breeding season. But why native plants? Insects have evolved over thousands to millions of years with the specific native plants they eat. And most moth and butterfly caterpillars eat only particular native plants or groups of plants. Thank goodness for the native trees, such as oaks and maples, found in many yards where gardens are almost exclusively non-native, because non-native plants reduce habitat quality for birds. A recent study found that Carolina chickadee populations can only be sustained if non-native plants constituted less than 30% of the plant biomass. Now again, thanks to trees, there hopefully are a lot of large native trees in your yard if you're not currently gardening with native plants otherwise. But most often, yards are comprised primarily of non-native plants. If we really want to help the birds, or the butterflies and bees, our yards need to be primarily planted with native plants, including trees. Many native oaks are excellent sources of caterpillars. Some oak species can support over 500 species of caterpillars. That's really mind-boggling. Some native trees, for example, the red and the sugar, support over 300 species of caterpillars. And some of those caterpillars even are available year-round. It's really cool to learn the biology behind some of the species of caterpillars. Bird populations are declining at an alarming rate. For example, Cape May warbler populations declined by an estimated 70% between 1966 and 2015. You won't find them at your feeder, but on May 9th this spring, when temperatures were near freezing, you may remember right there when we were near our last freeze frost date, we had a freeze. Cape May warblers ate aphids from our coral honeysuckle right on our deck. I took this picture from our dining room. So let's develop a habitat. We moved into our 30-year-old townhouse 30 years ago. About 18 months ago. And it's an interior townhouse, so the yard is small, limited, and but fortunately was almost a blank slate. So the first thing we did was identify existing plants and remove as many of the invasive exotics as possible. Going back to this slide, look at the only plant life in the front courtyard was a Japanese maple and vinca as ground cover. So the first thing we worked at was removing that vinca manually to avoid chemicals. And you want to do the same. You want to identify all your existing plants and remove the invasive exotics. Please don't start by cleaning up your yard. Instead, make sure you know what you have. You may end up, if you clean up, removing a lot of your great plants. Unfortunately, if you put invasives close to a forest area, like this one here, this is in a local neighborhood, if you put something like Miscanthus sinensis, which has very many common names, but unfortunately is very common in yards, it literally can spread into the local forests very quickly. Same with the plants like barberry and burning bush. Invasive plants are invasive because they proliferate. They displace and crowd out our native plants, and they drastically reduce wildlife habitat. Some of the common invasives in our yards in the New River Valley are ones that unfortunately landscapers plant all the time, and yes, garden centers sell. So if you say, I just don't know how to identify the plants in my yard, I encourage you to learn how to use iNaturalist and possibly seek to identify your plants. Helps you keep track of your plants, helps you everyone in the family become a citizen scientist, and you'll be surprised what you learn. iNaturalist is a free app. If you click on the icon and then go to the camera where it says observe and start taking pictures. You can add pictures so that you can look at all the different angles on, say, a plant or an animal, a salamander, a mushroom. And then you can click, once you feel you have good photos, and say, what did you see? They'll tell you whether they're fairly confident or not, but they'll give you 10 species that it may be. I found that more often than not, it's the very first species. But to be sure, always click on the eye to learn more information and look at a good picture of it and learn more about the plant before I choose what I think it is. To give you an idea of how quickly you can pick it up and how much you can enjoy it, my sister on the right just turned 75 this spring. She's in Maine, so I can tell that from this distance, and bought her very first smartphone in March, just as the pandemic was starting to take off in our country. And she shared learning iNaturalist. I shared it with her over the phone, putting each other on speaker and walking her through. She shared it with her friends from Africa, including the then 3-year-old, just turned 4 last week, son of her friend. and they have had a ball all summer identifying everything they can find. The 4-year-old now runs the forest and says, wait a minute, what's this? We haven't identified this one. Okay, so you want to begin choosing plants, and you want to always consider your conditions. What are your soil types? Is it a southern exposure? What kind of damage potential do you have? Do you have a lot of deer? And where are they most likely to travel? Are you restricted? We're restricted. We have to provide a plan for what we're going to plant, so it can be reviewed by our local landscape committee. You'll have a lot of limitations on availability sometimes. And you want to always think, when you're choosing plants, as much as possible, natives to our area, and what benefit do they provide to bees, butterflies, and birds. I very rarely use annuals in the ground, but the first year I used them as fillers. Turned out I really didn't need them. You want to choose a diversity of plants that will be available in some form. Always have species going from early spring through late fall. We'll have a list of plants available with their common and scientific names from the website. But let's look at names, because they can be very confusing. And I can't tell you how often I've seen people come home with the plant that they thought they had and it was not. Now, a scientific name or botanical name is made up of the genus and what the entire 2 words, binomial, species name. So the species name, a species name is actually 2 words. Now they'll say, oh, no problem, use the scientific name, because there are so many plants with the same common name, or the same plant may have quite a few common names. So let's use an example of Linicera sempervirens, coral honeysuckle. It's native to the New River Valley. I have it in multiple places in my yard and on my deck. But look at, so if you go to the garden center and you're looking for Linicera, well, guess what? Hopefully they don't sell Japanese honeysuckle, but Japanese honeysuckle is Linicera japonica. So the botanical name is the 2 words together. Please don't go just looking for the first word, and the second word won't help you at all either, because many plants may have the same second word in the name. So genus is Linicera, the whole name together is the species name. Well, if you want to have a little more confusion thrown in, even scientific names have been changing quite a bit due to a lot of genetic work and DNA work. So I always check to make sure if I hear or am confused by a plant name. I check the virginiaplantatlas.org, the digital atlas of Virginia flora. And for each species in the state, it will show you whether it's native with red dots in your county, or blue if it's introduced. And it will tell you the current botanical name, some of the common names, and some of the, quote, synonyms or now obsolete names, or names that are no longer used. So black cohosh is a perfect example. It was Simistifuga racemosa, and I love the way Simistifuga rolled off my tongue, but guess what? It's no longer Zactea racemosa. Sometimes the whole name changes. So first thing we did in our townhouse is we removed the vinca manually, and we started putting in ground covers, started from the ground up. Now, usually you may start with the larger trees and shrubs, but that opportunity wasn't really available to us under our situation. So started primarily with the smaller plants. Remember, there was a Japanese maple. We had a lot of dry, compacted shade. We had root competition. So an example of plants I first started putting in was wild geranium. Another one was Jacob's Ladder. Now this is just after 1 year of growing, but at our previous home, they very quickly seeded and became a nice ground cover in some areas, helping bees and hummingbirds and providing great understory. When we started putting in herbaceous plants, I wanted ones that would fill in fairly quickly to at least not have such a blank slate. And so I put in 2 coral honeysuckles, one since I've since removed on this side, that did not do well in the dry compacted soil, and that side has thrived on this side, and species like threadleaf coreopsis. Now, if you see a name after that, that is usually a selection. And so yes, it is threadleaf coreopsis, Coreopsis verticillata, but the Zagreb is a selection that is what you usually find at the garden center. Now, I try to grow host plants for all of our 6 species of swallowtails that we have locally, and for the monarchs and the fritillaries and many other species of butterflies. So I always try to choose plants, if possible, that are excellent host plants. Most of our butterflies will only use a particular native plant or group of plants. So this is a tiger swallowtail that we had our very first summer here in the townhouse on the hop tree that I had in a pot. Monarchs, I'm sure you're aware, lay their eggs on butterfly plants. Milkweed plants, including butterfly weed and swamp milkweed. So our first summer here, the butterfly weed that I put in had eggs deposited both on the leaves and on the seed pods, some monarch egg. And my swamp milkweed was covered in monarch caterpillars. Now, aphids, we'll talk about them more, but aphids are a favorite of birds, and they never seem to bother the monarchs. They just eat away. So if anyone saw the aphids, and often you see the aphids first, and used any kind of chemical at all on them, you would be killing the monarchs at the same time before they perhaps were big enough to notice. Some other ground covers that I've added to replace the vinco. Fortunately, we didn't have ivy, but many of our townhouses do. Labrador violet, which is a host plant for fritillary butterflies, and wild ginger, which can provide an alternate host for pipevine swallowtails. Black swallowtails will lay their eggs on members of the carrot family, it used to be called the parsley family, and rue. So you need to think about it. I always do, I've got 5 different pots going with lots of herbs in them. And sure enough, they will choose your dill. Here's a black swallowtail laying an egg on dill at our last house. Here's the size of the egg, a penny for size of comparison. And they'll also lay their eggs on parsley. And the black swallowtail caterpillar can do parsley in a hurry, but they always grow back out quickly, often way bushier than they were in the first place. But you want to keep an eye out for them. I found that if I plant rue, which is a non-native herb, in pots, and don't have to have too much of it, and you'll end up finding that the black swallowtails will prefer the rue and hopefully leave your herbs alone so you don't end up inadvertently eating a butterfly or an egg. I mean, not a butterfly, a caterpillar. Okay, now remember those monarchs that were so dense on the swamp milkweed down below our deck? Well, they climbed everywhere, including up on the deck, and we could watch them complete the metamorphosis right on our deck. When you start working on any story and choosing your plants, you want to think about multi-purpose plants. And a great multi-purpose native plant is spice bush. Here's a small spice bush I put in the front of our courtyard to eventually grow large enough to provide screening in summer. It will also provide the host plant, and it did in our very first summer, for the spice bush swallowtail butterfly. This spice bush is on butterfly weed, but it actually laid its eggs on spice bush. It has great fall color, full of fruit that the birds love. It's one of my favorite plants, and fortunately, it's not one of the deer favorites. But as you know, they'll eat anything if they're hungry enough. The spice bush swallowtail butterfly is so much fun to find because the caterpillar stage, because it only feeds at night. It makes this little hiding place, this nest during the day. And so the only way you can find them is look for the nest folded leaf, first the folded edge of a leaf, then eventually the whole leaf when they're in the final instar stages. And you can very carefully and gently open them, and you'll find an earlier stage caterpillar, or really fun, a later stage caterpillar. And they will lay their eggs on either spice bush or on sassafras. Another favorite of mine, favorite native and favorite butterfly, is the zebra swallowtail. And it only lays its eggs on pawpaw, which is a fabulous mid-story plant. At our other house, I was able to get any number of pawpaw patches going. I just love them. And they provide fruit for a number of mammals. It's the largest native fruit in North America. And I was able to find a nice little pawpaw tree at Crow's Nest Nursery and planted it across the street from us on the edge between our shared property and a town right away. But I've also grown quite a few of them from seed, that just picking pawpaws along the river. Another screening plant I've used temporarily while I'm waiting for my spice bush here to take off, and it's growing quickly and already supporting caterpillars, is putting small native trees in pots. This is an eastern arborvitae. It's been in the pot for 3 summers. Some of them have done well and some of them have not, but arborvitae tends to do pretty well in a pot situation, especially if you give it enough sun and enough water. Also, as understory, I've used a lot of native ferns, not only in pots, but directly in the ground. And I'm finding that most of the species are doing really well, even in fairly poor soil. I use rescued containers for areas with really poor growing conditions. There's no moisture underneath the eaves of the house, which is a good proportion of the space in our front courtyard and even in our back. So a rescued, very, very shallow, not even probably an inch deep in the center, but the plants seem to literally be growing through the wooden bowl, a fire pit. And these are some of the plants that do well in those conditions, some of the native plants that are doing great. This is an old discarded ceramic fire pit and had the entire bottom had broken out. So someone was obviously throwing it away. Wasn't a fire pit anymore, but lined with wire cloth and screen. This was probably the first time I tried a fire pit, and it's probably been about 10 years. And these same fringed bleeding hearts, can you tell I have a lot of favorite natives? Another favorite native survives really well because even when it went years with no watering, these are the original plants, the foliage will die back, but it spreads easily from seed. It comes right back from the tubers. If you deadhead it, you'll get flowers throughout the summer. Not in this profusion. This is how it will look early in the spring. Fresh water is where I chose to put my fresh water in the front courtyard because I see it every morning and think to dump it out and refill it. But it's very important that you have fresh water year-round and that it's very shallow. Birds don't need much water at all. This is one my mom made years ago out of a very shallow depression in the ground filled with some leftover concrete. And she dripped her hose. You can see the water where it just barely dripped. And the birds, especially the warblers, but all the birds love that. And you want to figure out a way either to have electricity in the winter to keep your water from freezing, or I dump mine out first thing every morning and refill it throughout the day if needed when it's freezing. By this summer, just a little over a year when I started putting plants into the blank slate, we had a good layer of herbaceous plants going, good screen, and a really private courtyard for reading the paper early in the morning or just relaxing, taking a deep breath. I wasn't going to do anything with the backyard. Initially, it's very small, has utilities running through it, had the remains of a stump of an old tree and all of the roots of the old tree. Had no intentions of doing anything. But I stuck originally all the pots from my last house I didn't know what to do with in behind what shrubbery there was. And then always kept adding discovered finds that people were discarding and using pots in the back helps to keep big space plants smaller. You can use them for seedlings. It's all kinds of things you can do by using pots. Some more examples of rescued planters. This is a grill lid filled with native plants. This was just some fun things I did for my aunt, but unfortunately haven't been able to visit her this summer due to the virus, of filling a fire pit and thrown out hibachi grills with celosia. Old fountain I found that had a hole in it, no longer held water, but it's great for plants. If you pinch the plants, especially in the pots, if they're plants that prefer to bloom later in the summer or in the fall, you can get a really thick plant. This was a fairly small cardinal flower I've pinched throughout the summer. This is a snake root that was the chocolate variety, slowly reverting back to the native, which I'd really prefer, but it's hard to find the specific species. It's often a variety or a cultivar of some kind. You can put plants in pots to try to hide at least somewhat the utilities, which I did. And you can put oversized trees or vines in pots. This is below our deck, hiding the downspout and kind of filling in that bare corner. The hop tree, if you go back and look at this tree that is being taken over by the Dutchman's pipe, this tree is in a pot, and it's a native common name hop tree, and it's a wonderful host plant, preferred host plant for both giant swallowtail butterfly and tiger swallowtail. I love the giant swallowtail caterpillar, really fun to watch. as it goes through its stages of instars. This is an adult. The tiger swallowtail is so hard to observe, even though it will use fairly many species, including things like tulip tree and black cherry. But the thing about keeping a hop tree, which is a low understory native tree, especially if you keep it in a pot and keep it pruned back, is you can watch all the instars of something like the tiger swallowtail. When it first emerges, the first stages look like a bird dropping. Then it starts looking a little different, and then you can see it's one of those really cool caterpillars. It sets itself up on kind of a netting, you can see, of almost a mesh type netting. So it's surprising that the birds don't go for it because it's always exposed and easy to find. The tiger swallowtail is our state insect, and the males are always yellow. The females are often black, and this pair cooperated by mating on the hood of my car last summer here at the townhouse. Build the habitat, they will come. And you can tell if it's a black female from the other black swallowtails because you can actually see those stripes, the tiger stripes, especially if you have good lighting. The Dutchman's pipe vine that I have in the pot on the corner of the backyard is a host plant for the pipevine swallowtail butterfly. And they're hard to get pictures of because they flutter their wings quite a bit. This one is actually nectaring on our deck on Brazilian verbena. But the host plant is a native plant, and the caterpillars, a lot of the swallowtails will just lay a single egg, and the monarchs will lay a single egg. The pipevine swallowtail will lay a bunch of eggs together, and then the caterpillars, for fairly many stages, instars, will feed together. It will look like an army of caterpillars. Some of the larger host plants that I'm experimenting with may end up outgrowing their spot, but this is wild senna that I had not intended to plant here, but there was this space just asking for some kind of native. Now it looks like it's a shrub, and actually it acts like a shrub, but it is a herbaceous plant. It dies back to the ground in the winter, and so is fairly easy to control, although you always want to prune carefully. You want to look for eggs, learn to identify the eggs. This is a giant swallowtail egg on hop tree. You may ask me, how do I know that? Well, I either watch them lay it, if I'm lucky, see it in action, or I'll watch it and see what develops, what hatches, and watch the different stages or instars that the caterpillar goes through. Sulfur eggs are really cool. All the eggs have some different quality, and it's fun to learn the differences. To get more space in the back, I'm trying to go vertical some, either with the trellis or using the lattice on the deck. The first summer, again, I had not planned to do a thing in the backyard, but by the end of the first summer, I had dug out all the, I had mattocked out the tree stump, removed all the roots very carefully, aware of the utilities, put in a native witch hazel, and the pots that I brought from the other house apparently all had seeds of Salvia coccinea, Texas sage in them, and so we had beautiful display of flowers, even though not intentional. Unfortunately, this summer, the landscapers spread pre-emergent before I realized what they were doing in this bed, or the whole thing would have been filled with any number of seeds that I had thrown out in huge volume last fall. So going to the deck, the pots on the deck provide great habitat and privacy. Just love it. We keep a camera in the dining room area here so we can take pictures. I started out with a lot more larger pots on the deck. I have 2 coral honeysuckles in pots on the deck. Also had those 3 arborvitaes that I'd planted just before we moved in pots. But now I'm sticking with the coral honeysuckles as the native base, hope to expand that soon. Just on the coral honeysuckle alone on the deck this spring and summer, I had the Nashville and Cape May warblers eating aphids off of the coral honeysuckle in early spring during migration. Very important fuel for them as they go along the way. And just a few weeks ago, the goldfinches were shredding the stem of the coral honeysuckle and collecting it as nesting material. And I've learned from an experiment this summer, well, starting in the spring, that if I don't try to get rid of the aphids by manually removing them, the insects will come in, especially the ladybugs, even if they are non-native ladybugs. They come in and they eat the aphids, and really the plants that I manually controlled, well, actually just one plant in the front of the house, has not even fared as well as the ones that are doing very well, that I let the aphids do their thing, let the birds enjoy them. And we've had a number of species continue to eat the aphids through the summer. Letting vines go over a rail or using hanging baskets can expand your space when you have limited space. This is a new favorite this summer that I just happened to see at Crow's Nest. It's called a bat-faced kufia. If you look here, the individual flowers look just like a bat face, and the hummingbirds have loved it. Not a native, but a great plant to bloom all summer, all spring, summer, and into the fall. But filling the deck with color has allowed us to feel as though we're bringing all this into the house when we're working at the dining room table every day. That wasn't planned for this summer. Now, to really get the pots up where they're giving you privacy and where you can really see the birds and butterflies, I've rescued a lot of different, or repurposed a lot of different plant stands, turned over pots, old broken shelves, an old vanity stool, removed the cover and replaced it with a tile. Depending on the frost freeze date, annuals provide really 6, even in this warmer few years, more than 6 months of nectar. And you can see by the middle of October last year, the zinnias I had on the deck and the kufia for the hummingbird, not natives, but great annuals to bring the hummingbirds in, and the butterflies right to your back, were still there in great bloom in mid-October. Hummingbirds love salvias. I have a number of different salvias, fuchsias. This monarch is on Brazilian verbena, a favorite of butterflies, but also hummingbirds will use. This hummer is on black and blue salvia. This hummer is on Texas sage. This one is on Gardenmeister fuchsia, and these were all on our deck last summer. Having the deck just outside our door, especially with the camera set up, allows us to learn so much when you can take a picture and then even look closer. For example, this is a question mark butterfly on Profusion zinnia, and I've always had trouble seeing the actual question mark when people say, oh, look, there's a question mark. But when you take a picture on your deck, or if you have your binoculars always ready, as we do, you can see them. And the question mark is one of the angle wing butterflies that looks like a dead leaf when the wings are closed. And it's important to know that a lot of the butterflies will even hibernate as adults here in the winter in tree crevices or in wood piles or things like that. You may see them flying on warm days. Another species that does that is the mourning cloak. And so you need to think about that whenever you're doing anything in your habitat. Some other great close-ups to help you figure butterflies out right on your deck. All of this was last summer on our deck. The butterflies are only slowly coming in now. Let's hope they'll be as diverse and in the numbers they were last summer. But are the American lady and the painted lady butterflies. A little hard to tell apart. You can see them right up close. You can see this is looking off our deck in our townhouse community. The different sulfur butterflies, like the sleepy orange and the cloudless sulfur, have been easy to see on our deck, and you bring in all kinds of beautiful butterflies, including the common buckeye. And last summer, at some points, we had as many as 5 different species on the deck at one time of butterflies. Excuse me. Keep in mind that chemicals harm the bees, the butterflies, the birds, and at the same time, they can eliminate a natural enemy that may already be there of the pest that you're trying to control. This is a native columbine, but it's a dwarf variety of the native columbine that I have in a pot out front. And you can see they all have this wonderful leaf miner, which I'm sure there are people that go, oh no, what's happened to my columbine? But I think it's kind of cool if you stop and think that first, chemicals don't do anything to a leaf miner in a situation like that. So no matter what you tried to do to spray that, the leaf miner is inside the leaf. You're not going to impact that. You may be killing the natural enemy, and you may be killing something like a caterpillar you don't see, because columbine can be a host plant for the columbine dusky wing. Birds depend on insects and seeds that winter over in last summer's plants. So when the fall comes and frost kills things back, you want to remember to leave your herbaceous vegetation standing until spring. And also native bees use what many people would consider untidy areas of the garden, including brush piles, old tree stumps, snags. The fritillary butterfly, seen here on a butterfly weed, native butterfly weed, actually lays its eggs in the leaf litter near the host plant in the fall, and they'll hatch and they'll hide in the leaf litter all day, and then they come out and feed at night, just the way the spicebush caterpillars do. Other critters that use leaf litter, oh, they're countless, but robins spend a lot of time in leaf litter. The rufous-sided towhee you'll often see in your leaf litter. Very important in your understory. Again, thinking about cleaning up the garden, look at this Tennessee coneflower and how I happen to be lucky to see that it had a black swallowtail chrysalis on it. So anything you clean up could have any number of critters that are really important that you have been working hard to keep. Did you know that butterflies, depending on the species, in some species even you'll get a mix of what overwinters, but here butterflies overwinter in one of 4 stages. They can overwinter in the egg stage. That could be most anywhere on plant debris, could be in the leaf litter. They can overwinter as a caterpillar, as the chrysalis, or as an adult butterfly, as we talked about with the angle wings and some other species. So clean up, deadhead, and compost very gently. There are a lot of sources for lists of plants for our area. In Talamy and Dark's book about the living landscape, there is a wonderful list of plants in the back. And there'll be notes that tell you how important. They'll show you whether it's important for primarily bees and butterflies or for any number of critters. There's some great websites. The Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries just recently changed their name and are still in the process of changing everything over on their websites, but it's now the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, and they have lots of materials. Carol Heiser has done a great job on putting habitat materials. The Virginia Native Plant Society has quite a few materials available for plants to plant. The Department of Conservation and Recreation, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, has excellent information both on native species and invasives. And then a great way to learn a lot is to join the New River Valley chapters or your local chapters wherever you are of the Native Plant Society, the Master Naturalists, and the Bird Club. Most of those are currently meeting online as Zooms, but as soon as everything's back to normal, hopefully you'll be able to become active. I would look forward to meeting people. The Virginia Native Plant Society has come out with some great native plant guides, but the Mountain Region Guide is in progress. The plant guides are online, they're beautiful. You can see the full color pictures of the native plants. If you go and look at either the Capital Region or the Piedmont region, they'll have plants that a lot of the plants apply to us here in the Mountain Region. I would definitely not look at the one from Tidewater because they are in such a different ecosystem than we are. There's a great list of plants, but without the color photographs on either the Native Plant Society or the Department of Conservation and Recreation's plant website for the Virginia Mountain Region specifically, because as much as possible, you want to choose your native plants from our region. I buy almost all my plants either locally at Crow's Nest Greenhouse or at Wood Thrush Natives in Floyd County in Virginia. Remember, even though we're in the midst, I think we're all so worried about the virus right now, you want to make sure you don't forget the tick issue. This is my usual garb, pants tucked into socks, very light colored clothing. I don't usually spray, but if I'm going to be in a really heavy duty area for ticks, I will spray my clothing. Try to always take a shower as soon as you come in and do a full body check every day that you've been outside, because there are all kinds of diseases with ticks. And needless to say, if you build it, they will come. And we have all of these critters here in our townhouses, even though I took these pictures at our last house. And we have all of these critters in our townhouses community, including occasionally the bears. And when it comes to deer-resistant plants, the deer just don't read the lists anymore. So try to pick plants that are deer-resistant, but also choose where and how you plant things. These were all pictures I took at our previous house. Fortunately, they tend to stay a little bit away from our townhouse, but wait till tomorrow, it may be different. And please, please, please help us all keep the bears and the other wildlife wild. The bears in Blacksburg have become quite a problem, and you're doing no favors to anyone if you attract wildlife in, because it can end up harming the wildlife way more, especially if they have to be removed. But I would encourage you to step outside, look for simple gifts every day, take a deep breath, and use your special outdoor space as your way to relax and chill during these unique times. Thanks for joining me.